Everyone. We on? Is the mic on? Got to check. All right. There we go. All right. There's a lot of things that we've obviously changed in our life in the last couple of weeks, months, and they take some getting used to. As we're all sitting here with our masks, for the most part, I'll say I've gotten used to wearing a mask. Work, when you go to the store. But there's one thing, one part of it I haven't gotten used to, and that's the fact that people can't see my face. I forget they can't see my face. I know that's ridiculous because it's a mask. Of course, that's what it's doing. But if I'm at the grocery store or out somewhere, I like to smile at people. If they're having a hard time, or maybe they have a little kid doing something funny, I like to smile. Well, when you have a mask on, that doesn't translate well. So instead of a smile, it's just me staring at the person. And I don't really think about it because, again, I forget they can't see until they kind of look at me weird. I'm like, oh, yeah. So it takes some getting used to, and I'm working on it. There's a lot of things in life that take some getting used to. For instance, Taco Bell recently, a couple months ago, got rid of the beefy Frito burrito. It was the best dollar you could spend at a fast food restaurant. Crushing, absolutely crushing. Still haven't gotten over that one. Similarly, a couple years ago, Skittles got rid of the lime as the green and changed it to green apple. Some people like it. I'm not a fan. I've gotten used to it. I still eat the whole bag of Skittles, of course, but it's not my favorite. Another one that always kind of sticks with me, there was a guy at work, his name was Sam. Well, that's Sam Wise, but his name was Sam, so I knew him as Sam, and one day he decided he wanted to be Samuel. I mean, that was his full name, but he asked people to start calling him Samuel. I just couldn't do it. It wasn't out of disrespect or anything. It's just I was so used to Sam, I couldn't get used to it. So instead, because I didn't want to disrespect him, I just called him by his last name. There's many things in life that, whether it's changes or new things, that just take getting used to, and sometimes you just have to get used to it. That's what you do. We have things that change, and it's funny, one of those phrases, get used to it, that depending on the tone or who's delivering that phrase, it changes the meaning wildly. I mean, like a little kid coming home from the first day of school, or maybe a spouse, the first day of a new job, and it was kind of a rough day of maybe their mom or wife, husband says, oh, it's okay, honey, you'll get used to it. It's very nice and comforting. At the same time, if the reason the kid had a bad day is because a bully pushed them down and took their lunch money and said, hey, you better get used to it, that's very different meaning in tone of that word. But that's just how it works. It kind of falls in line with, if someone's mad, you say, oh, don't be mad, or relax. It doesn't work so well if you just tell someone to do it. But the fact of the matter is, in life, there's many things we have to get used to. And really, we have a couple options if we're going to get used to it. You can accept the new situation, the circumstances, and move on and keep doing what you're doing. Or you can also let the circumstances take over you, direct your actions, your life, and how you feel about things. There's also the secret third option is you just don't get used to it. You make a change. You change the situation. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about this morning. Growing up in my grandma's house, she had this on the plaque. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Growing up, I never knew that was a thing. I just thought it was like a nice plaque she found sometime. Of course, it's better known as the Serenity Prayer. Often used in 12-step recovery programs. It was actually written back in the 1930s by Reinhold Niebuhr, I think his name was, and kind of spread through churches in the Northeast in the 30s and 40s, and then I think finally in like the 1950s, it was published in like the New York Times or a journal or something. And I mean, frankly, it's a very nice sentiment, not directly from the Bible, based on biblical principles. And we see it's a nice thing to get us through. 2020 has certainly been a unique year for many of us. Recap where we've gotten to this far. Worldwide, start off the year with brush fires in Australia. We had that almost World War III everyone talked about with Iran. Of course, locust swarms, volcanic eruptions in the Philippines, that giant explosion in Beirut. All these terrible, horrible things that happened that, took people's lives, took people's families, their homes, caused them to be evacuated. Things that well out of their control that require them to get used to it or accept it. And a little more locally here in the United States, we had our own wildfires on the West Coast. Protests or riots going on most of the summer, even some now. Election angst. I think angst is probably the nicest word for it. Even now, we still deal with it. Economic turmoil, and of course, COVID this year is probably going to be the biggest thing remembered of all these things. And through all these things, there's not a lot we could do about it. They happen. For the most part, it's not any. Sure, you can have a part to play in these things, but for most cases, it's not something that one person is all of a sudden just going to be able to change, and so we kind of have to accept it as part of our life. Normally, when we talk about accepting things or the bad things happen, we always go to Job. Job's the book of all these bad things happen to him, the loss of his family, all of his possessions and everything, and through it all, he shows that he still trusts and believes in God. But I think there's another place I'd like to go this morning, and that's the book of Daniel. I love the book of Daniel. It's probably my favorite book in the Old Testament. The character of Daniel that we see is him doing all of these things, glorifying God in the face of adversity, never backing down. We have him in the lion's den. The passage we read this morning as a congregation is the proclamation from King Darius, the one who made the law that resulted in Daniel getting thrown into the lion's den. That's what he said after Daniel comes out safely, proclaiming that about God. And of course, there was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Another great story of three men that came out with Daniel. And they refused to back down when they were thrown in the fiery furnace. That's very unnecessary, I know, but I thought it was fun. But probably one of my favorite verses in the Bible, in Daniel chapter 3, with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're told that, hey, you have to bow down, worship the idol. And in verse 17, it says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. These guys were facing death. And they said, you know what, we have full confidence in God that he can save us. But if he doesn't, that's okay. We're still not going to do what you want. It's just the boldest, most courageous thing, and I just love it. But we're not going to talk about any of that this morning. What I want to talk about, looking at the Serenity Prayer, accepting things we can't change, changing things we can, I find all of that is very nicely summed up and mirrored in Daniel chapter 1. So we're going to step through that a little bit this morning. So starting in verse 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So when we're talking about accepting things we can't change, King of Babylon comes in, besieges Jerusalem, takes off things from the temple of God, the gold and the other precious things. And we know this isn't just a fleeting thing, like, oh, it's going to get better tomorrow. The reason he did this, it said the Lord gave Judah over to him. We know God remembers his promises. Unfortunately, that means good and bad. There were some bad things that happened, and this was part of the result of that, of God punishing them. So he gave Judah up. But it wasn't just the temple things that were stolen. It was people, the finest young men that Israel had to offer, the king of Babylon took away. So that's the situation now that Daniel and his friends are faced with, being taken from their homes, being forced to go work for another king of a foreign land. And we see, continue on in verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they would enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So these 4, plus many other Israelites, taken from their home, forced to go study another culture, be immersed in their culture, given new names. You know, when I was in high school, I took 3 years of Spanish. I got pretty good. But teachers and everyone else agreed that the best way to really learn the language was full immersion, going to a Spanish-speaking country, spending some time there. You're fully surrounded by the language and the culture, and that's how you learn. Well, this is what's happening now with these Israelite men. They are fully immersed, but it's not immersion so much, it's indoctrination. They took purposely the most handsome, smartest, most physically able men, and they were going to make them servants of Babylon instead of Israel. And for the most part, that was okay, actually. They accepted that. Daniel and, I'm just going to say Daniel and friends. It's easier. They accepted that. Taken out of their home, okay. The Lord had given Judah over to the king of Babylon. Not much you can do with that. They accepted it. Providing training, sure. They knew who God was. They knew what they believed. Learning the language, the customs of this other place, it wasn't going to change that. So they were okay. Called by a different name. Okay. And it's really unfortunate because they had some very nice meaning names. Let's see. Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, beloved by the Lord. Mishael, who is as God. Azariah, the Lord is my help. So those were their Israel, nice given names. Now they have names that mean Bel's prince, illuminated by sun god. Who is like Venus, servant of Nego. Like, they're not great names, but it was part of that indoctrination. But even that, they knew who they were, so that was okay. But the one thing they couldn't take, which seemingly is the smallest of all of these things, is they weren't going to eat the food. They rejected the food. And it was the only thing that was taking them away from God and what God commanded them to do. So as we go back to our serenity prayer, courage to change the things I can. Well, they had the courage to make the change. Rejecting the king's table, the food the king himself was picking out, it was rejecting the king. It's not a very light thing to do. And we assume it doesn't say that all the other Israelite young men were probably already taking part and just going along with it. So they were going to stand out, be outcast from there. Of course, there was also the threat of physical punishment. Babylonian king, Persian kings, these other kings, not known for being the nicest people or doing the nicest things. And of course, it was probably good food. I mean, it's the king's food. You have to imagine it's a pretty nice spread. So, I mean, that in itself you think would be pretty good. But again, it was the thing that was taking them away from God. So what did they do? They chose to make a change. Again, God had already blessed them with knowledge and wisdom. So they come up with this plan and offer to eat the other food, eat stuff that they knew wasn't going to go against God, of not being kosher or food sacrificed to idols. And so they did their plan, their 10-day food vegetable cleanse. And it turns out at the end of the 10 days, God has blessed them. They look even healthier and better than all the other men that were eating the king's table. And what happens because of that? God blessed them even more. In verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kind. So they took these actions. Of all the things there were, nothing really affected that much until it came to the things that affected their relationship and their following God's commandments. So if we look back at the life of Daniel, that is really kind of summarized for us in chapter 1. He accepted his life away from home. There wasn't much he can do about it. He accepted serving foreign kings. As we read throughout the rest of the chapter, Daniel just grows higher and higher in the hierarchy of serving these kings. He interprets the dreams, is put in charge of many things, and that was okay. But he made changes where change was necessary. If something impacted his relationship with God, he made a change. And he didn't forsake God. We see that with the lion's den. And he gives glory to God. Whenever he interprets a dream later in the other chapters, it's not me, it's God that's telling me this. And through all that, it helped others to see the glory of God. So he had this set of circumstances that was terrible. Kidnapped from his home, forced into another culture to be surrounded by those, not just not believing in your God, but going against your God. But he didn't let those circumstances crush him or or change who he was. He got used to it, but he thrived in it. He thrived in those situations. So what does that mean for us? We can have that same acceptance of our circumstances. In Philippians 4, as we did in our study, whenever that was, a year ago or so, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. There's a lot that goes on in our life. There's a lot of good things, there's a lot of bad things. But through all, we have to know that God is in control. And so it's okay to accept that, hey, this is a condition of life. This is how life is going to be. We can get used to it, but it doesn't mean we have to let it overwhelm us or crush us. We have the peace of God, so we know that he is in control, and the good things work for him and not for the circumstances that we're in. One of the things that, go back and look at the Serenity Prayer, it says, courage to change the things I can. In the fuller, more original version maybe, it says, courage to change the things which should be changed. And I think it ties in nicely with the next line of wisdom to know the difference between those you can or can't change. While it's a small, slight thing, the difference between can and should is actually pretty large. I can eat a whole pizza by myself. I should not eat a whole pizza by myself. So there's a big difference between can and should. And it's the same thing for us in applying this of, there's a lot of things we can do, but what are the things we should be doing? And I think the example of Daniel, again, is there anything that's taking us away from God? Is there things taking others away from God? Or are they bringing us closer to God? Those are the things that we should change. We should be looking at. If we continue on in Philippians, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. These are the things that we should change. If our mind is not set on those things, if our mind is not set on Christ, if our actions are not in keeping with Christ's commands or what God's will for us is, those are the things we should change. Whatever else is going on in the world, it'll still go on. But if our mind is set on that, set on Christ, that's the things we should be focused on. In verse 9, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So it's not just thinking about these things like, no, I should really change that. Well, of course you should, but we have to put it into practice. We have to make the change. There's a lot of things that have happened this year, as we talked about. And frankly, there's going to be a lot more stuff that happens next year and the year after that, and every year after that for always until Christ comes back. And we can get used to it. It's okay to get used to those bad things happening. But we need to make sure that we are doing what we should to draw closer to God, to draw others closer to God, so that in the end we can stand firm in our belief of Christ and know that we ran the race and we did well. And we can look back and see that, we didn't just get used to our life, but we thrived in it. We thrived because we have Christ and we have God watching out for us. If there's anything you need, come forward as we stand and sing.